Like, do cultures actively choose to be matriarchal or patriarchal?
That's a good question. I think that I don't think it's that people really make a choice. Like, I'm going to sit there, hey, shall I be a patriarch today or not? Right? But we do see patriarchy arising as a result of certain conditions. So if we go back 100,000 years, back in the time when humans were hunter-gatherers, women could still be beaten, they could still be abused, they might still be raped, they could still be married polygamously, at least as we know from contemporary hunter-gatherers. So it wasn't a feminist utopia, but there's no evidence at the moment that women were secluded, like they weren't kept inside their homes. They were really vital to the forager economy. They went out to gather herbs, gather fruits, etc. Then there seems to be a big step change, not with the Neolithic Revolution, but a little bit later, when you have the plough, when you have irrigation, when you have domesticated crops, domesticated herds, then people have inherited wealth. So that inherited wealth was very insecure because other men might come to want your stuff, right? So what did men do? They tended to gather as patrilocal clans to protect their stuff, right? So you want strength in your brothers, your uncles, your cousins. So when we see the rise of the plough, where we see domesticated herds, those groups tend to be patrilocal. Then another big step change occurred with military technologies. So there were some groups that were especially patriarchal. So, for example, the Yamnaya that came from the steppe, that came from the Eurasian steppe. Certain groups in the Middle East seemed to be especially patriarchal. And when they had improved military technologies, that is the horse, and chariots, the chariots that were developed around 4,000 years ago, they conquered other groups and institutionalized patriarchal dominance. So when a group of patriarchs captures a city, then they can impose their rule of law. And then those patriarchal authorities can amass more power and wealth because their armies enable them to conquer new land, they're amassing all those resources, and they can institutionalize patriarchy. And because they're the elites, then everyone might look up to them and want to be like them. So how do you act like the elites? Oh, well, you also become much more patriarchal. So, for example, you start secluding women. We have also the axial age. So this is the birth of religions, specifically moralizing supernatural punishment. And many of those like Abrahamic, Christian, Hindu religions, they tended to have this idea that women should stay at home, that women should be secluded, and really importantly, that men's honor depends on protecting women's chastity. And so in those societies, women tended to retreat to the private sphere. So religion and culture seem to reinforce these things. But all this is shaped by geography. So in cultures where mountains or oceans or parasites stop some of those changes, then you don't see the emergence of female seclusion. So, for example, many of those Yamnaya pastoralists, they never made it to the Americas because of the massive Atlantic Ocean, right? So those patriarchal conquests didn't happen in Latin America. So in the pre-colonial period, native indigenous people, none of them had this idea of female seclusion. That just didn't come here. And I think one of that is the fact that these patriarchal people didn't conquer. But also, importantly, the biggest animal was the llama. So that llama makes it harder to accumulate wealth, because you can't transport that wealth. So it's much, much harder to accumulate wealth through the llama. So elsewhere, trade would have led to some big rich men becoming super, super rich through trade, where it's harder. Whereas for example, in the Andean region, Ainu communities, they tended to be much more egalitarian. They had communal wealth, and so women weren't secluded. In fact, women were very vital to what they call minga labor, which is like reciprocal labor. Across North America and also in Brazil, another factor is that groups can move around, and so they really valued female labor. Many of these groups were matrilineal, tracing descent through the female line. Now, none of that means that women were necessarily autonomous or necessarily free. Like, for example, the Inca would go around different villages and take girls aged between 11 and 14 to be like virgins, to be sacrificed or to be given to provincial headmen. But the point is that in indigenous American women were never secluded. And this is the really, really important thing, female seclusion. Because it's female seclusion that shapes whether women in the 20th century go out to work or not. So, around the world, there's a big difference in whether cultures prioritize female seclusion. So in some societies like the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and historically in East Asia, men's honor depended on female chastity. And that's a result of the forces I mentioned earlier. And so as the 20th century enables job-creating economic growth, in those societies, even if people see job opportunities, because men's honor is so dependent on women remaining at home, on women's chastity remaining secure, they may say, hey, it's just not worth it. It's really important for me to be seen as honorable, to be seen as respected. So I don't want anyone to start gossiping about us. So therefore, women won't go out to work. So in those societies, you need a massive level of job-creating economic growth for female employment to rise, because the available income has to be sufficiently high to compensate for men's loss of honor. And that's what happened in East Asia. The factories opened all over, lots of factory recruiters came to the villages, and fathers were like, hey, I care about my honor, my face, but it was worth it. The income returns were so good. Now, in Latin America, it's slightly different. Because the indigenous people did not have such a strong preference for honor, and also because many of the European migrants did not have this strong conception of female seclusion, then you need less job-creating economic growth for women to go out and work, right? And in fact, in Latin America, we've seen that female employment is often anti-cyclical. That is, when business is really bad, women go to work because they're desperate for family survival, and more families increasingly rely on female labor force participation. So in Latin America, women really flock to economic opportunities. So with increased female education, with falling fertility, and also a really big and under-recognized fact about Latin America is that Latin America has a very high percentage of people living in cities relative to its level of development. So if you look across the world, in poorer countries, people tend to be much more rural. Latin America is actually heavily urban. It's just as urban as many European countries. And this makes a big difference for several things. One is it enables social norms to change much more quickly. If you're gathering in cities and towns, you're connected by radio, you read newspapers, you see alternatives, you see strikes, you see protests. And you might see a woman dressed going to an office. You might see a street mural celebrating women. You see someone building her own house. And all that heterogeneity, all that diversity makes you rethink your beliefs, whether it's about women or about the church. So cities really catalyze social change. It can make people reject their traditional beliefs and become much more open and liberal and secular. And that's a very important part of Latin America's story. It's not just that women need to work, but also Latin Americans have especially more middle class people, have become much more secular. And I think cities are an important part of that process, that people see and hear different ideas. And so Latin Americans really increasingly embrace liberalism. And that's important for female employment. So I was recently in Mexico for a month, and I interviewed Mexican men and women in 6 different towns, and many of them told me that people used to gossip a lot, and people would be very sensitive to that gossip. So if people were saying, hey, that's a woman with young children, she should really be at home, or hey, that woman shouldn't be doing this, they might even bully a woman. So a group of women may go around and speak negatively about the woman who they pass, or say, that's no good, that's not respectable. Or people would even say, what will people think? I don't want to do this because what will people think? And so if people anticipate social disapproval and really care about that disapproval, then maybe the man doesn't want his wife to work, or the woman herself doesn't want to work because they worry about all this social censorship. But I think over the past 50, 20 years, in much of Latin America, and especially in cities, people have become much more individualistic. So they're less concerned about social judgment and disapproval. They're much more focused on, okay, let me make sure I have economic security. Let me make sure I can provide for my children. And for that, we need 2 earners. Like, I'm not going, whatever, even if someone down the road thinks this isn't good, whatever, they're not, people in Mexico would say, even if I'm judged by some woman down the road, she's not going to help me. Right? She's not going to pay for my children's education. She's not going to feed me tomorrow. So let me focus on doing my thing. Let me get ahead and whatever. So I think this process. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your original question, but I think this is part of the process of how cities and some economic opportunities, in conjunction with falling fertility and rising female education, means that we now see this change over time.